The next morning came too soon for Sarah. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of the barracks, replaying the moment when Jake had seen her scars. She knew that look on his face meant trouble was coming. In her experience, people like Jake never kept information to themselves when they thought it could give them some kind of advantage or entertainment. Sarah was right to be worried. During breakfast in the mess hall, she noticed Jake sitting with a group of other young soldiers, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing in her direction. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their expressions told her everything she needed to know. By the time she finished eating, she was certain that her secret was no longer secret. The confirmation came during the morning equipment check. Sarah was inspecting radio batteries when she heard Jake's voice behind her, louder than necessary and clearly intended to be overheard. "Hey, Martinez," he called out with false casualness. "I was wondering about something. Yesterday when we were packing up, I couldn't help but notice those interesting marks on your arm. Looks like you've got some experience with explosives, huh?" Sarah didn't turn around. She continued checking the batteries, her movement steady despite the anger building in her chest. She had faced worse than this before, and she wouldn't give Jake the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But Jake wasn't finished. Encouraged by the attention he was getting from the other soldiers who had stopped their work to listen, he continued his verbal assault. "I mean, those are some pretty serious battle scars you've got there. Must have been quite the story. What happened? Did you get too close to something that went boom?" His voice carried a mocking tone that made it clear he found the whole situation amusing, rather than serious. Several other soldiers had gathered around now, drawn by the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable with Jake's behavior, but others seemed entertained by the drama. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Finally, she turned to face Jake. Her expression was calm, but her dark eyes held a hardness that should have warned him to back down. Instead, Jake seemed to take her quiet response as encouragement to continue. "Come on, Martinez. Don't be shy about it. We're all soldiers here. We've all got stories to tell. Some of us just wear our stories on our skin, right?" He gestured toward her covered arm with a grin that was meant to be friendly, but came across as cruel. "Those scars must have quite a tale behind them," Jake continued, his voice growing more confident as he sensed he had an audience. "Let me guess, you were in some kind of accident? Maybe not paying attention when you should have been? It happens to the best of us, though usually not with such permanent reminders." The implication in his words was clear. He was suggesting that whatever had happened to her had been her fault, the result of carelessness or inexperience. It was exactly the kind of assumption that Sarah had hoped to avoid by keeping her past private. Other soldiers in the group began to shift uncomfortably. Even those who had initially been entertained by Jake's performance were starting to realize that he had crossed a line. There was a difference between friendly teasing and cruel mockery, and Jake had moved firmly into the latter category. But Jake himself seemed oblivious to the changing mood around him. Emboldened by what he mistook for support, he pressed on with his attack. "I bet that's quite a story, though. What do you think, guys? Should we start calling Martinez Scarface? Or maybe Boom? You know, in honor of whatever went boom near you?" He laughed at his own joke, though the laughter sounded forced and uncomfortable even to him. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She had endured months of physical therapy and psychological counseling after the explosion. She had fought through nightmares and flashbacks, through moments when the sound of a car backfiring could send her diving for cover. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, choosing to serve her country instead of hiding from the trauma that had nearly destroyed her. And now this smug, inexperienced boy was turning her sacrifice into entertainment for his friends. "You're right about one thing, Peterson," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent group. "I do have a story, but you might want to be careful about making assumptions when you don't know what you're talking about." Jake's grin faltered slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of the others. "Oh, come on, Martinez. Don't be so sensitive. We're just having a little fun here. No need to get all serious about it." "Fun?" Sarah repeated, stepping closer to him. "You think someone else's pain is fun? You think scars are something to joke about?" "Hey, I'm not trying to hurt anyone's feelings here," Jake said, though his tone suggested he didn't really care about her feelings one way or another. "I'm just saying if you're going to be in the army, you've got to expect a little ribbing, especially when you're walking around with evidence of whatever rookie mistake put you in harm's way." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rookie mistake. as if the men and women who had died in that convoy had somehow brought their fate upon themselves. As if the explosion that had torn through her arm and changed her life forever had been the result of carelessness rather than the calculated evil of people who planted bombs to kill innocent people. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. For a moment she seriously considered showing Jake exactly what kind of rookie mistake it would be to continue pushing her. She had learned more than just radio repair during her time in the army. She had also learned hand-to-hand combat, and she was confident she could teach this arrogant boy a lesson he wouldn't forget. But before she could act on that impulse, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone in the group immediately snapped to attention. The voice belonged to General Patricia Hayes, the base commander, who had apparently been walking past and heard the commotion. General Hayes was a small woman in her 50s, but she carried herself with an authority that made her seem much larger. Her gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Jake's face went white as he realized who was standing behind him. He had been so focused on his performance for the other soldiers that he hadn't noticed the general's approach. Now he stood frozen, unsure of how much he had heard and afraid to find out. General Hayes looked around the circle of soldiers with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by innocent expressions. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she waited for someone to answer her question. When no one spoke immediately, her gaze settled on Jake, who was clearly struggling to find words. "Well, soldier?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. "I asked if there was a problem. From what I could hear as I approached, it sounded like you were having quite an animated discussion about someone's scars." Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had gone from confident and mocking to terrified in the space of seconds. "No, ma'am, no problem at all. We were just talking about training exercises and equipment checks." The general's eyebrows rose slightly and a thin smile played at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Training exercises and equipment checks, I see. And does your discussion of training typically involve making jokes about battle scars?" The color drained completely from Jake's face. He realized that the general had heard much more than he had hoped. Around him, the other soldiers stood perfectly still, grateful that they weren't the focus of her attention. "I wasn't making jokes, ma'am," Jake said weakly. We were just having a conversation about experiences and—" "Stop," General Hayes said quietly. But the single word carried such authority that Jake's mouth snapped shut immediately. "Don't make this worse by lying to me, Peterson. I heard exactly what you were saying, and I heard the tone you were using. What I want to know is whether you have any idea who you were talking to." Jake glanced nervously at Sarah, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Ma'am, I know she's Specialist Martinez and she works in communications and—" "Do you know her call sign, soldier?" the general asked, interrupting him again. The question caught Jake completely off guard. Call signs were typically earned through significant actions or events, and they were often deeply personal to the soldiers who carried them. He realized suddenly that he had never heard anyone refer to Sarah by anything other than her last name. "No, ma'am," he admitted reluctantly. General Hayes nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "Her call sign is Phoenix," she said, letting the word hang in the air between them. "Do you know what a phoenix is, Peterson?" Jake nodded uncertainly. "It's a bird from mythology, ma'am. It burns up and then comes back to life from its own ashes." "That's right," the general said. "A creature that rises from destruction stronger than before. Now let me tell you how Specialist Martinez earned that call sign." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She had no idea that General Hayes knew the details of her past, and she certainly hadn't expected those details to be shared with Jake and the others. But the general continued before Sarah could object. 2 years ago, Specialist Martinez was working as a civilian contractor in Afghanistan. She was part of a convoy that hit an improvised explosive device. The blast killed 3 people and wounded 7 others, including Martinez herself. Jake's smug expression was completely gone now, replaced by growing horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The explosion threw Martinez from the vehicle and set fire to the communications equipment she had been working on. Burning metal tore through her left arm, causing the scars that you found so amusing. But instead of focusing on her own injuries, Martinez crawled back into the burning wreckage 3 separate times to pull out wounded personnel. The general paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The group of soldiers stood in absolute silence, hanging on every word. She saved 2 lives that day before the medics arrived and forced her to accept treatment for her own wounds. The doctor said later that if she had waited another few minutes to get medical attention, she would have lost her arm entirely. But she risked permanent disability to save her fellow soldiers. Sarah stared at the ground, uncomfortable with being the center of attention and with having her private ordeal made public. She had never wanted recognition for what she had done that day. In her mind, she had simply done what needed to be done. But General Hayes wasn't finished. After months of recovery and rehabilitation, Specialist Martinez made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. Instead of accepting the disability compensation she was entitled to, instead of returning to her comfortable civilian job, she enlisted in the United States Army. Jake looked like he wanted to disappear into the desert sand beneath his feet. The confident young soldier who had been making jokes just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the true meaning of shame. She completed basic training with distinction, the general continued. Her instructors noted her exceptional leadership potential and her ability to remain calm under pressure. When she was asked why she wanted to serve, she said that the explosion had shown her that she belonged with soldiers, that she wanted to be part of something bigger than herself. The general's eyes moved from Jake to the other soldiers in the group, making sure that each of them understood the lesson being taught. So when you made your little jokes about rookie mistakes and battle scars, Peterson, you were mocking someone who has already shown more courage and dedication to this country than you may ever have the opportunity to demonstrate. You were making fun of someone who earned her scars by putting other people's lives ahead of her own safety. Jake's legs looked like they might give out beneath him. He had gone from feeling superior to Sarah to realizing that she was everything he only pretended to be. The weight of his cruelty was crushing him. Now, General Hayes said, her voice taking on an even sharper edge, I want you to think very carefully about your next words. You have shown disrespect to a fellow soldier who has earned her place here through sacrifice and service. You have demonstrated poor judgment, worse character, and a complete lack of understanding about what it means to be part of this army. The desert wind stirred the dust around their feet, the only sound breaking the tense silence that had settled over the group. What do you have to say for yourself, soldier? Jake stood frozen for several long seconds, his mind racing as he tried to find words that could somehow undo the damage he had done. But he was beginning to realize that some mistakes couldn't be taken back, and some words couldn't be unsaid. Finally, he turned to face Sarah directly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with shame and regret. Jake's voice cracked as he struggled to find the right words. Specialist Martinez, He stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. I had no idea. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I said. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant young soldier who had mocked her just minutes before, but a scared young man who was finally beginning to understand the weight of his actions. She nodded slightly, accepting his apology, though she could see in his eyes that he would carry the shame of this moment for a long time. General Hayes wasn't satisfied with Jake's apology alone. Peterson, you will report to my office at 1400 hours. We're going to have a much longer conversation about respect, judgment, and what it means to be part of this unit. In the meantime, you will spend the rest of today cleaning every latrine on this base. And you will think long and hard about why someone who calls herself Phoenix deserves your respect and admiration, not your mockery. Yes, ma'am, Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible. The general then turned her attention to the other soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. The rest of you will return to your duties, but I want you to remember what you've learned here today. Every soldier in this unit has a story. Some of those stories involve sacrifice and courage that you can't see just by looking at someone. Before you judge your fellow soldiers, before you join in when someone is being mocked or bullied, remember that you might be laughing at a hero. As the group began to disperse, General Hayes called out to Sarah, Specialist Martinez, a word with you. Sarah approached the general, unsure of what to expect. She had never spoken directly with the base commander before, and she wasn't sure how she felt about having her personal history shared so publicly. Walk with me, General Hayes said, gesturing toward a path that led away from the main training area. They walked in silence for several minutes, the sound of their boots on the sandy ground mixing with the distant noise of military vehicles and training exercises. Finally, the general spoke. I hope you don't mind that I shared your story back there. I know it's personal, and I know you didn't ask for that kind of attention. Sarah considered her words carefully before responding. I understand why you did it, ma'am. Peterson needed to understand what he was doing. I've always preferred to let my work speak for itself. General Hayes smiled, and this time it was genuine warmth rather than the cold authority she had displayed earlier. That's exactly what I thought you'd say. It's one of the reasons I've been keeping an eye on you since you arrived here. Sarah was surprised. You've been watching me, ma'am? I make it my business to know about every soldier under my command, but especially those with your background. When I heard that a civilian contractor who had been wounded in Afghanistan was enlisting, I was curious. When I read your file and learned about what you did that day, I was impressed. When I saw how you've conducted yourself since arriving here, I was convinced. They had reached a small observation area that overlooked the main training field. General Hayes stopped and turned to face Sarah directly. Convinced of what, ma'am? Sarah asked. That you have the potential to be an exceptional leader in this army. Not just because of what you did in Afghanistan, though that certainly demonstrated your character, but because of how you've approached everything since then. You've never asked for special treatment because of your injuries. You've never used your story to seek attention or sympathy. You've simply done your job with professionalism and dedication. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just do what needs to be done, ma'am. Same as everyone else. No, General Hayes said firmly. Not the same as everyone else. What happened back there with Peterson proves that. Most soldiers would have responded to his mockery with anger, or by fighting back. You stayed calm and professional even when he was deliberately trying to hurt and humiliate you. That takes a special kind of strength. The general paused, watching a group of soldiers running training drills in the distance. Tell me, Martinez, what are your long-term goals in the Army? The question caught Sarah off guard. She had been so focused on proving herself day by day that she hadn't spent much time thinking about the future. I want to serve my country, ma'am. I want to be useful. That's a good start, but I think you're capable of much more than just being useful. Have you considered applying for officer candidate school? Sarah's eyes widened. Becoming an officer had never occurred to her. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. I've only been in the Army for a few months. Experience isn't the only qualification for leadership, General Hayes said. Character matters more than time in service. The ability to make good decisions under pressure matters more than knowing all the regulations by heart. And the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult matters more than anything else. She turned to look directly at Sarah. You've already demonstrated all of those qualities. You showed courage and leadership under the worst possible circumstances in Afghanistan. You've shown dedication and professionalism here at Fort Bradley, and today, you showed the kind of restraint and maturity that some soldiers never develop regardless of how long they serve. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the general's words. I appreciate your confidence in me, ma'am, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. Nobody ever feels ready, General Hayes said with a slight laugh. I certainly didn't when I was first promoted to lieutenant 25 years ago. But readiness isn't about feeling prepared. It's about being willing to step up when the opportunity comes. They began walking back toward the main base area, passing groups of soldiers engaged in various training activities. Sarah noticed that several of them looked at her with new interest, clearly having heard about the confrontation with Jake. I want you to think about what I've said, General Hayes continued. You don't have to decide anything right now. But I believe the Army needs leaders like you, people who understand what real sacrifice looks like, people who have been tested and proven themselves under fire. As they approached the communications building where Sarah worked, the general stopped once more. There's something else I want you to know, she said. The call sign Phoenix didn't come from your commanding officer in Afghanistan. It came from the soldiers you saved that day. They started calling you that while you were still in the hospital recovering from your injuries. It spread from there until it became official. Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. She had never known the origin of her call sign, and learning that it had come from the people she had helped made it mean even more to her. They said you rose from the flames that day stronger than before. They were right, and I believe you're still rising. General Hayes saluted Sarah formally, a gesture of respect that surprised her. Sarah returned the salute, her mind spinning with everything she had heard. The rest of that day passed in a blur for Sarah. Word of the confrontation with Jake and General Hayes's revelation about her past had spread quickly through the base. Everywhere she went, soldiers looked at her with new respect and curiosity. Some approached her to express their admiration for what she had done in Afghanistan. Others simply nodded respectfully when they passed her in the corridors. Sarah found the attention overwhelming. She had joined the army to serve, not to be treated as some kind of hero. All she wanted was to do her job and prove that she belonged among these soldiers. Now she felt like she was under a microscope, with everyone watching to see if she would live up to the reputation that had suddenly been thrust upon her. That evening in the mess hall, Sarah sat alone with her dinner, trying to process everything that had happened. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Jake approaching her table until he cleared his throat nervously. "Specialist Martinez, could I talk to you for a minute?" Sarah looked up to see Jake standing beside her table, his face still pale and drawn from the day's events. He looked like he had aged several years in the few hours since the confrontation. "What do you want, Peterson?" she asked, not unkindly but without warmth either. "I wanted to apologize again, properly this time. Not because the general was standing there, but because I need you to know how sorry I am for what I said." Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. Jake sat down, his hands fidgeting nervously with his cap. "I've been thinking all day about what the general told us," he began. "About what you did in Afghanistan. About how you earned your call sign. And I realize that I don't just owe you an apology. I owe you my respect." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but all she saw was genuine remorse and shame. "I came into the army thinking I knew what it meant to be a soldier," Jake continued. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about Vietnam, about the brave things he did and saw. I thought I understood what courage looked like. But I didn't. I was just a kid playing soldier, looking for ways to feel important." He paused, struggling with his words. "When I saw your scars yesterday, I thought they were a sign of weakness. A mistake. I couldn't have been more wrong. Those scars are proof of something I've never shown. Real courage. Real sacrifice." Sarah remained silent, letting him work through his thoughts. "I spent this afternoon cleaning latrines and thinking about what the general said, about how every soldier has a story. I realize that I don't have a story yet. I haven't been tested. I haven't had to choose between my own safety and someone else's life. I've never even been in a real dangerous situation." Jake's voice grew quieter. "You have, though. And when that moment came when you had to choose, you chose to risk everything to save other people. Not once, but 3 times. Even when you were already hurt and bleeding." Sarah finally spoke. "I didn't think about it like that at the time. I just saw people who needed help." "That's what makes it so incredible," Jake said earnestly. "You didn't think about being a hero. You just did what needed to be done. That's what real soldiers do, isn't it? They don't think about glory or recognition. They just do their duty." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other soldiers from their unit. Sarah tensed slightly, wondering if they had come to stare at her like some kind of exhibit, but instead they approached with respectful expressions. "Mind if we join you?" asked Sergeant Williams, a veteran soldier who had served 2 tours in Iraq. Sarah nodded, and the soldiers sat down around the table. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Sergeant Williams broke the silence. "I wanted to thank you, Martinez, for what you did today with Peterson here, but also for what you did in Afghanistan." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah said uncomfortably. "I was just doing my job." "No," said another soldier, Corporal Davis. "You were doing more than your job. Way more. And the fact that you don't see it that way makes it even more impressive." Sergeant Williams nodded in agreement. "I've seen a lot of soldiers in my time, Martinez. Some who talk a big game but fold when things get tough. Others who don't say much but step up when it matters. You're clearly in the second category." Jake listened to this conversation with growing understanding. These were experienced soldiers, people who had seen real combat and understood what courage looked like. And they were treating Sarah with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or forced. "The general mentioned something about officer candidate school," Sergeant Williams continued. "I think that's a great idea. This army needs more leaders who understand what real sacrifice means." Sarah felt her cheeks burning. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for that. Leading other people is a big responsibility." "You've already proven you can handle responsibility under pressure," Corporal Davis pointed out. "Most officers never get tested the way you were in Afghanistan. You've already shown you can make life and death decisions when lives are on the line." The conversation continued for another hour, with more soldiers joining the group as word spread. Sarah found herself sharing stories about her civilian contractor work and her recovery after the explosion. In return, the other soldiers shared their own experiences and challenges. Jake remained mostly quiet during these conversations, listening and learning. He was beginning to understand that being a soldier wasn't about acting tough or impressing others with bravado. It was about service, sacrifice, and being willing to put others first when it mattered most. As the evening wore on, Sarah realized that something had changed in how the other soldiers saw her. But more importantly, something had changed in how she saw herself. For months, she had been focused on proving that she belonged in the Army despite her past. Now she was beginning to see that her past wasn't something to overcome. It was something that qualified her for leadership in ways that classroom training never could. When the group finally began to break up, Jake lingered behind as the others left. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I have one more thing to say." Sarah waited, curious about what else he might want to discuss. "I hope you decide to go for officer candidate school, not because you need to prove anything to anyone, but because soldiers like me need leaders like you. Leaders who've been where we might have to go. Leaders who understand what we're really signing up for when we put on this uniform." He stood up to leave, then paused. "And I hope that someday, if I ever face the kind of situation you faced in Afghanistan, I'll have half the courage you showed that day." As Jake walked away, Sarah sat alone in the now empty mess hall, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been just another soldier trying to fit in and do her job. Today, she was being encouraged to consider becoming an officer and leading other soldiers into potentially dangerous situations. The idea was both terrifying and exciting. She thought about the soldiers she had served with in Afghanistan, both as a civilian contractor and now in the Army. She thought about the young men and women like Jake who came into the military with good intentions, but little understanding of what real service meant. Maybe General Hayes was right. Maybe her experiences had prepared her for something more than just maintaining radio equipment. Maybe her story could help her guide others who would face their own moments of testing. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Jake, Sarah found herself standing outside General Hayes' office, holding a manila folder containing her application for officer candidate school. The decision hadn't come easily. She had spent countless hours thinking about what leadership meant and whether she was truly ready for such responsibility. The turning point had come during a training exercise the previous week. Sarah had been assigned to lead a small communications team in setting up a temporary command post. The exercise had started routinely enough, but halfway through, the scenario had changed. The trainers had introduced a simulated emergency situation where the team had to evacuate their position quickly while maintaining communications with scattered units. Sarah had watched her team members look to her for guidance, and in that moment, she had seen something familiar in their eyes. It was the same look she had seen in the wounded soldiers she had pulled from the burning convoy in Afghanistan. It was the look of people who needed someone to make the hard decisions so they could focus on doing their jobs. Without hesitation, Sarah had taken charge. She had organized the evacuation, prioritized which equipment to save and which to abandon, and maintained communications throughout the chaotic exercise. Her team had performed flawlessly under her leadership, and afterward, several of them had told her that her calm confidence had made all the difference. That night, Sarah had finally understood what General Hayes had been trying to tell her. Leadership wasn't about having all the answers or never feeling afraid. It was about being willing to make decisions when others needed someone to lead, even when the path forward wasn't clear. Now, standing outside the general's office, Sarah took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in," came the familiar, authoritative voice. Sarah entered to find General Hayes sitting behind her desk, reviewing a stack of papers. The office was spartanly decorated, with military awards and commendations covering one wall and a large map of the region covering another. "Specialist Martinez," the general said, looking up with a smile. "I was hoping I'd see you here soon. Please have a seat." Sarah sat down and placed her application folder on the desk. "I've been thinking about our conversation, ma'am." "About officer candidate school." "And?" General Hayes asked, though her expression suggested she already knew what Sarah's decision had been. "I'd like to apply. If you still think I'm a good candidate." General Hayes picked up the folder and began reviewing Sarah's application. As she read, her expression remained neutral, but Sarah thought she detected a hint of satisfaction in the general's eyes. "This is well prepared," the general said after several minutes. "Your recommendations are strong, And your essay about leadership philosophy shows real insight. Sarah had struggled with that essay, trying to put into words what she had learned about leadership through her experiences. In the end, she had written about the difference between leading from a position of authority and leading from a position of service. There's something I should tell you, General Hayes continued. Your application won't be processed through normal channels. Given your unique background and the circumstances of your enlistment, it will go directly to the Pentagon for review. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. Is that good or bad, ma'am? It's unusual, the general replied. But I believe it will work in your favor. The Army is always looking for officers with real-world experience and proven leadership ability. Your record speaks for itself. The general set the application aside and leaned back in her chair. I want to talk to you about what comes next, whether you're accepted into OCS or not. I've been watching how the other soldiers have responded to you since that incident with Peterson 3 weeks ago. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. The attention from her fellow soldiers had gradually returned to normal levels, but she was still adjusting to being seen as something other than just another communications specialist. What have you observed, ma'am? I've seen soldiers seek you out for advice. I've seen them look to you for leadership during training exercises, even when you weren't officially in charge. I've seen Peterson himself become one of your strongest supporters. That last point was true. Jake had undergone a complete transformation since their confrontation. He had approached Sarah several times to ask for guidance on various aspects of military life, and he had begun conducting himself with a new seriousness and respect for others. Peterson asked to speak with me last week. General Hayes continued. He wanted to know if he could request you as his team leader for future training exercises. He said he'd learned more about being a soldier from watching you work than from any manual or classroom instruction. Sarah was surprised to hear this. Jake had never mentioned speaking to the general about her. Ma'am, I hope you understand that I never asked for any special treatment or recognition. I just want to do my job and serve my country. I know that, General Hayes said. And that's exactly why you're the right person for this. The best leaders are usually the ones who don't seek leadership for its own sake. They're the ones who step up because the situation requires it, not because they want the prestige or authority. The general stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the main training area. Sarah could see groups of soldiers conducting various exercises in the distance. Can I ask you something personal, Martinez? Of course, ma'am. Do you ever regret your decision to enlist? Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you had just taken the disability compensation and gone back to civilian work? Sarah considered the question carefully. Sometimes I wonder about it, ma'am, but I don't regret it. The explosion changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I couldn't go back to my old life because I'm not the same person I was before. How are you different? Before Afghanistan, I thought I was just someone who was good with technology. I had a comfortable job, a nice apartment, a predictable life. I thought that was enough. Sarah paused, trying to find the right words to explain something she was still figuring out herself. But when that convoy was attacked, when I saw people dying and wounded, I discovered something about myself that I never knew existed. I found out that I could function under extreme pressure, that I could make life and death decisions, that I could put other people's needs ahead of my own safety without even thinking about it. General Hayes nodded, still looking out the window. After the explosion, I realized that I needed to be in a place where those qualities mattered, where I could use them to serve something bigger than myself. The Army gives me that opportunity. And if I become an officer, I'll have the chance to help other soldiers discover those same qualities in themselves, to prepare them for the moments when they'll be tested, to help them understand that being a soldier isn't about individual glory, but about service and sacrifice. General Hayes turned back to face Sarah, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, the general's expression was openly impressed. That's exactly the kind of thinking the Army needs from its leaders, she said. I'm going to personally recommend your application to the Pentagon. More than that, I'm going to request that you be fast-tracked through the process. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Everything was happening much faster than she had expected. In the meantime, General Hayes continued, I'm going to start giving you more leadership responsibilities here at Fort Bradley. You'll be leading larger teams, handling more complex assignments, and getting the kind of experience that will prepare you for OCS. The general returned to her desk and made a note in Sarah's file. There's one more thing, Martinez. I want you to start thinking about your long-term goals. If you successfully complete officer candidate school, where do you see yourself in 5 years? 10 years? It was a question Sarah had been afraid to ask herself. The future had seemed so uncertain for so long that she had focused only on the immediate challenges in front of her. I'm not sure, ma'am. I suppose I'd like to continue serving wherever the Army needs me most. That's a good answer, but I want you to think bigger. The Army needs officers who understand what real leadership looks like. Officers who have been tested under fire. Officers who can inspire others through their own example of service and sacrifice. General Hayes stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. I believe you have the potential to be that kind of officer, Martinez, not just because of what you did in Afghanistan, but because of who you've become since then. You've risen from the ashes of that explosion stronger and more focused than before. That's why they call you Phoenix. 6 months later, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood in front of her first platoon as a newly commissioned officer. The gold bars on her shoulders still felt strange and new, but the confidence in her voice was unmistakable as she addressed the 30 soldiers under her command. Good morning, soldiers. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Lieutenant Martinez, and I'll be your new platoon leader. I know some of you may have questions about my background, so let me address that right away. Sarah looked out at the faces before her, seeing a mixture of curiosity, respect, and in a few cases, skepticism. She had learned during officer candidate school that earning respect as a leader was an ongoing process, not something that happened automatically with promotion. I enlisted in this army as a specialist just over a year ago. Before that, I was a civilian contractor who was wounded in Afghanistan. Some of you may have heard about that. What you may not know is that everything I've learned about leadership, I've learned from soldiers like you. She paused, letting her eyes meet those of several soldiers in the front row. I'm not here to tell you that I have all the answers, because I don't. What I can tell you is that I understand what it means to serve, what it means to sacrifice, and what it means to put the mission and your fellow soldiers ahead of yourself. That's what I expect from each of you, and that's what you can expect from me. In the back of the formation, Jake Peterson stood at attention with the rest of the soldiers. He had been transferred to Sarah's unit at his own request, wanting to serve under the officer who had taught him the true meaning of military service. The arrogant young man who had mocked her scars was gone, replaced by a dedicated soldier who had found his own sense of purpose. After dismissing the formation, Sarah walked back to her office, still adjusting to the idea that she now had her own office and her own unit to command. The transition from enlisted soldier to officer had been challenging, but officer candidate school had prepared her well for the responsibilities she now carried. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Jake Peterson entered and stood at attention. "Ma'am, do you have a few minutes? I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course, Peterson. Have a seat." Jake sat down, but his posture remained formal. Despite their history, he was careful to maintain proper military protocol now that Sarah was his commanding officer. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for requesting me for your platoon. I know you didn't have to do that, especially considering how I treated you when we first met." Sarah studied the young soldier's face. The cockiness was completely gone, replaced by genuine respect and dedication. "You've earned your place here, Peterson. You've shown real growth over the past year. That's because of what I learned from watching you, ma'am. You showed me what it really means to be a soldier. Not the glory-seeking version I had in my head, but the real thing. Service, sacrifice, putting others first." Jake shifted slightly in his chair. "I also wanted you to know that I've been talking to some of the other soldiers in the platoon, the ones who might have questions about having such a young lieutenant. I've been telling them about what you did in Afghanistan, about how you earned your call sign." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's not necessary, Peterson. I can handle any concerns about my leadership on my own." "I know you can, ma'am. But I also know that respect has to be earned, and some soldiers need to understand what they're looking at when they see those scars on your arm. They need to know they're following someone who's already proven herself under fire." There was a longer knock on the door, and General Hayes entered without waiting for permission. Both Sarah and Jake immediately stood at attention. "As you were," the general said with a slight smile. "Peterson, I need to speak with Lieutenant Martinez privately." "Yes, ma'am," Jake said, saluting both officers before leaving the office. After Jake had gone, General Hayes sat down in the chair he had vacated, How are you adjusting to command, Lieutenant? It's challenging, ma'am, but I'm confident in my abilities. The soldiers seem willing to give me a chance to prove myself. I'm sure they are. Word has gotten around about your performance at OCS. Your instructors were very impressed. Sarah had graduated near the top of her officer candidate school class, earning recognition for both her academic performance and her leadership abilities. More importantly, she had earned the respect of her fellow candidates, many of whom had initially been skeptical about her unconventional path to officership. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting, General Hayes continued. The Pentagon has been reviewing the reports from your OCS instructors, as well as your performance here at Fort Bradley. They're considering you for a special assignment. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. What kind of assignment, ma'am? They're putting together a new training program for officers who will be working with civilian contractors in combat zones. Given your unique background, they think you'd be ideal for developing and leading this program. The opportunity was both exciting and daunting. Sarah would be responsible for training other officers to work effectively with civilian personnel in dangerous environments, helping them understand the challenges and opportunities that came with such partnerships. The assignment would mean a promotion to first lieutenant and a transfer to Fort Leavenworth. You'd be working directly with some of the Army's top training specialists to develop curriculum and training scenarios. Sarah considered the offer carefully. It would mean leaving Fort Bradley and the soldiers she had just begun to lead, but it would also give her the chance to influence how the Army trained its future leaders. Ma'am, what about my platoon? I've only been their leader for a few weeks. I understand your concern, but this is exactly the kind of opportunity that your experiences have prepared you for. You have insights into civilian-military cooperation that very few officers possess. The Army needs those insights to be shared more widely. General Hayes leaned forward in her chair. Besides, the best leaders are the ones who prepare their units to succeed even in their absence. From what I've observed, you've already begun doing that. Sarah thought about her soldiers, particularly Jake and the others who had shown such remarkable growth over the past year. They had learned not just from her direct instruction, but from her example of quiet professionalism and dedication. When would this assignment begin, ma'am? In 6 weeks. That would give you time to prepare your platoon for transition to a new leader, and to complete some preliminary planning for the new training program. Sarah made her decision without further hesitation. I'd be honored to accept the assignment, ma'am. General Hayes smiled with obvious satisfaction. I thought you might say that. The Army is lucky to have officers like you, Martinez. Officers who understand that leadership isn't about personal glory, but about service to something bigger than yourself. After the general left, Sarah sat alone in her office thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years ago, she had been a civilian contractor focused on technology and equipment. Today, she was a commissioned officer being entrusted with training future military leaders. The scars on her arm were still there, still visible reminders of the explosion that had changed her life. But she no longer saw them as marks of trauma or weakness. They were proof of survival, of the ability to rise from destruction and find new purpose. She thought about the soldiers she would be leaving behind, particularly Jake, who had transformed from her harshest critic into one of her most devoted followers. She thought about the officers she would be training in the future, helping them understand the complexities of working with civilian personnel in dangerous environments. Most of all, she thought about the meaning of her call sign, Phoenix, a creature that rises from its own ashes, stronger and more magnificent than before. Sarah Martinez had indeed risen from the ashes of that convoy attack in Afghanistan. But her transformation wasn't complete. It was ongoing, a continuous process of growth and service that would define the rest of her military career. As she began planning for her new assignment, Sarah realized that the explosion that had scarred her body had also revealed something essential about her character. It had shown her that she was capable of courage, sacrifice, and leadership in ways she had never imagined. The young soldier who had once mocked her scars had learned to see them for what they truly were, badges of honor, earned through service and sacrifice. And now, Sarah would help teach other officers to recognize and appreciate the hidden strengths and experiences of the people they would lead and work alongside. The Phoenix had risen, and she was still ascending.